My name is Gita Yegane Arani. I'm reading a text with the title Qualities of Zoomorph Expressions. Humanized Animalisation, Thoughts on the Plush Animal Toys Phenomenon. This text is about animal sociology, namely an antibiologistic animal sociology, and about animal objectification, and it's written from an animal rights standpoint. Humanized animalisation, thoughts on the plush animal toys phenomenon. Why are there so many stuffed animal figures, and why do such animal figures enjoy a certain kind of popularity? Are stuffed animal figures, in principle, merely quite neutral stuffed figures with visually cute animal attributes, or are they actually somehow images of non-human animals? If they are animalized but actually neutral stuffed figures, then the animal features seem strongly indispensable after all. Why? What do these animal attributes represent in such figures? Or if one sees it in such a way that stuffed animals clearly represent non-human animals, then one could ask oneself, why do we harbor a tendency of a deprecating relationship towards non-human animals, but without clearly admitting these attitudes to ourselves in our attitude towards the childlike emotional? Why do we belittle such images of animals as something cuddly, and where does the sensual component come from that we see in these optically animalized figures as figurative touch objects? Perhaps it is precisely the fact that these figures are plush fabric objects created by us, and the real animals are real existences, completely autonomous from us, that we like the plush animals, because non-human animals remain unthreatening for us in this curious imaging function. They are figures, not beings. With the real beings, we are having an existential confrontation. Representations show what we see or would like to recognize in something or believe to see or to recognize. Perhaps the animal templates of these images do not interest us particularly in the positive because they are so different in factuality to us. They, as other biological animals, have evolutionized differently from us, and we prefer to leave all somehow possible explanations about the identity of non-human animals up to the experts, instead of exploring the complex communicative possibilities of our individual or intersubjective human-animal interactions ourselves. One could say that we have managed to settle our relationship to non-human animals by giving the relationship to them an emotional corner in the broadest sense, starting in the form of our mostly as a child lived relationship to figurative or abstracted images of them. And in the same breath, our humanity initiates itself in demarcation to the rest of nature, quote unquote. Our humanity initiates itself in reducing the reality of a human-animal encounter to a negation of their independent lives, value, and meaning, by seeing them as real existences solely in relationships conditional to us, as food products, objects of research, quote-unquote biological organisms of varying complexity, as totems or symbols, and perhaps also as comforters of the soul, as quote-unquote biological secondary beings to humans, etc., etc. In both our destructive and constructive considerations, however, what seems to fascinate us is that which constitutes the otherness and manifoldness of the animals we designate and identify. A quality of an otherness which we partly despise and love, but with which, seen over the whole plane, we can or want to deal so little integratively with regard to the question of ethical consideration that we have to keep them reduced in our conceptual terms in order not to fall into confusion. We might suspect that the position in which non-human animals are integrated into our cultures, in the thought edifices and levels of action of our humanness, that this is perhaps indeed based on an ideological compulsiveness of the exercise of violence in its most fundamental sense towards the natural, quote-unquote. And that this coercive character of our relation to non-human animals excludes our willingness to understand a specific animal diversity and its relation of diversity to us. And that consequently, we might see that with this missing engagement, the possibility of an ethical integration into our fields of thought is being excluded. Now, I don't want to put everything in connection with the stuffed animal and animal figure phenomenon, quote-unquote, but I see here an expression of an emotional relationship to the other, quote-unquote, biological animals. And through the examination of an emotional contextuality, finally at least some questions open up in the broader picture. Since the human-animal relationship is factually not predominantly based on interactive voluntariness in the real existential value of non-human animals probably has to elude us on the grounds of ethical exclusion. Perhaps, however, a fascination of that which is denied to us just by that arises. A fascination of the, even if arbitrarily, uncontained. I think that through such a fascination, which can be expressed both positively and negatively, we feel challenged to include non-human animals in our aesthetic systems in this uncomprehended position, and thus to try to get hold of them. By real existential value, I understand the inner independence of non-human animals to humans, which is given by their interconnectedness of own intra-non-human animals separated from us, of an own intra-non-human animal process separated from us, and by their own self-lived environmental contexts. They are on the one hand so similar to us, and on the other hand yet so different from us, in the contexts they form on this planet, as actual citizens of this planet. The real non-human animals and how we would like to see them. Animal documentaries, for example, predominantly show the mother-infant relationship, mating, hunting, and foraging behaviors of animals. What do non-human animals do other than the behaviors we focus our attention on from the standpoint of highlighting the supposed quote-unquote instinctual behavior in animals? nothing that would be relevant for them themselves. From our limited view about non-human animals, one can come to the assumption that every somehow quote-unquote individualized trait that can be attributed to a non-human animal or animal figure originates from an anthropomorphism, i.e., is a humanization. I believe with regard to the stuffed animal or any animal figure phenomenon that a certain kind of quote-unquote individualized attributions are in fact, in part and quite clearly so. They are partly and in so far anthropomorphisms, not because animals themselves are devoid of any individuality, but in the case of animal representations that work with accentuations of individuality characteristics, they remain, on one hand, primarily humanizing optical, quote-unquote, individualizers that lie strongly within the framework of ideas about what is visible to us as an, quote-unquote, individuality indicator in a standardized human way of individualizing characteristics. That is, that which can be considered as an expression of a certain characteristic, serious, silly, naive, sad, expressed as beady eyes, clumsy feet, big nose, in the manner of a figure language designed by us. But apart from our figure languages, on the other hand, at least concerning the purely existential, it is clear that non-human animal individuality exists in itself, although in a probably greatly different form or different forms. Yet perhaps we also want to replace the individuality expressions of animals, which probably runs differently. The animal individuality, which is foreign to us, runs differently with our chosen focal points in visuality, and the interferences which arise in the animal-human images, which can be found in the stuffed animals and cartoon figures, sometimes exert, though, a special fascination, because they in turn can run into the unlimited and ungraspable for us or get out of bounds, into the undescribed pages of a future realistic, non-anthropocentric, but rather animality respecting future, for example, and I mean non-anthropocentric in the sense of an explicitly or implicitly hegemonial anthropocentrism. On the other hand, the documenting images of what we call the reality of animals, that is, again, the animal documentations, they primarily throw light on observations made under purely biologistic points of views, and thus secondarily consciously guard themselves against quote-unquote humanizing attributions, at least as far as the supposedly critical human attributions are concerned. The accentuation, e.g., on the mating and feeding behavior of animals, however, makes clear over and over again an attitude in which further and for us more discrete activities of non-human animals are not supposed to be visible and deemed to be meaningless. To us, then, only a few behaviors of animals seem to be tangible, from a lack of a newly developed perspectivical breadth. And so we infer that what is relevant to us in our interest in non-human animals is that what is relevant to non-human animals. Less voyeurism on the part of humans in the human-animal interaction, please. Biological highlights, as they are presented in animal documentary films, are omitted in an individuated human-animal encounter. Such encounters would have to be contrasted and decoded differently, and the mutual interaction would have to be translated differently. But possibly we lack some communicative nuances for this. At least for the time being, a biologically oriented frame of reference should no longer suffice. Perhaps it is in the psychologically complex phenomenon of the Verniedlichung, the highlighting of cuteness of animals, that our distance to them is most strongly illustrated. The fact that we want to accept them solely as representations of their occurrence makes clear that our primary relationship to them is actually a secondary one. We are not interested on a level of uniqueness that can only express itself through an individualizable quality in a human-animal encounter, but rather we adopt the judgments and approaches of others or of the general public, and so forth. The relationship to non-human animals in their identity is ethically, from our side, actually so de-individualized as the real situations are in which we transfer these quote-unquote other animals. I generally notice with many animal characters that they often have decidedly quote-unquote humanized features. Is it that something appearing animalesque can give a character a more neutralizing quote-unquote or otherwise distinctive veneer than a character appearing exclusively anthropomorphic could? And is this due to the actual animal characteristic? Do human figures, on the other hand, in turn carry traits that we associate with human characteristic traits and cliches that the more animal-like forms are free of, because they offer something else that we may in part prefer to associate with? Is this where the blending of the two attributes, human and animal, come from? What do animal figures embody for us? It is also interesting to note that while stuffed animals tend to appear with more quote-unquote individual characteristics, but in any case, anthropomorphized, anthropomorphic features, schematic animal illustrations, which are intended to refer more clearly to non-human animals and do not enjoy cuddly animal status for human cuteness needs, that the animal figures or illustrations such as pictograms, for instance, that are intended to refer figuratively, factually to non-human animals themselves, in turn employ optical forms of de-individuation in their representation. Or is the cuddly animal phenomenon even a derivation or continuation of the exploitative aspect? That we use the beautiful sides, the sides of non-human animals that are pleasant to us, positive for us, for our purposes, whichever ones. That we have cemented the distance to non-human animals in such a complicated psychological form. I once had an idea that all companies that use animal figurines and illustrations in any form should help the animals they use in illustrations for their advertising, etc., via financial support of animal rights organizations or animal sanctuaries, etc. Wouldn't that be fairer? But you could say that we ennoble non-human animals by our views, whether as cuddly animals or as advertising symbols. But is that really so? If we would take now, instead of the animals as cuddly animals or animal advertising images, other figures, people, flowers, crystals, stars, or houses, etc., then the need, I'm quite sure, there for animal images would appear again somewhere. Maybe we try to compensate our disturbed relationship to non-human animals by our ways of depicting them, and thereby delude ourselves that we have no problems with the primary identity of the non-human animals, but nevertheless that the real animals just aren't proper cuddly toys like Maya the bee, Mickey Mouse, and the tiger duck. That we do respect the animal side of these figures, but the real animals are only biological, quote-unquote, evolutionisms, or eventually animal machines, like the card called animals. But can one say at all that the animal side is given only by the Gestalt? Probably yes, because in order to be a human being, the shape is also sufficient internally and externally, or is the human being alone on some kind of meta level? If so, perhaps one can just as well assume that being an animal, and thus also the animal right itself, also forms a kind of meta level. We give a meaning to the animal appearance only if it is graspable by us. Animals, however, are not graspable for us in the last consequence. Their distinctness and diversity elude our common standards of understanding. Even animal defenders make no secret of their tendency to misrepresent animals as pictograms or cute fauna evoking compassion, or as eternal victims, and thus to de-individualize and schematically summarize them, although this movement speaks of liberation and liberty, a high ideal. But how would it be to see non-human animals as a you and as an I that one meets and respects, even if one has in principle little idea of such a you or such an I, or at least cannot bring this realization to a collectivist understanding of animality, whereby one's own idea, one's own knowledge remains little communicable amongst humans. I don't see any sense in reducing my view to prefabricated images, neither by biologisms, anthropomorphisms, nor by conceptual meta-levels that only exclusively capture one's own thinking, as long as thereby being an individual, or being a living entity, or being a living subject is deprived of its value or its meaningfulness as such, independent of human chauvinism and human de-animalization and objectification. A footnote: the implementation of an emancipatory opening of barriers ordered by society and societies in their plural functions above all at the point of breaking given sociologically located constraints, defaults, and sets of rules within communicational norms and the realizations derived from them, and the kind of agreements equilibrated by these factors. I dare to make this presumption in Animal Rights ABC. How can I assert my basic human rights to demand fundamental animal rights? As the possible and so far untreaded solutional path, that could be included into the wider animal rights debate.